But in order to start that conversation, we have to be motivated to do it. Now, there are a lot of things that can motivate us to talk about spiritual things. First of all, it's something God wants us to do. It's something Jesus told us to do, right? The Great Commission. And it's something that we'll probably feel a little bad if we don't do it. All those things can temporarily motivate us to share our faith. But for me, the only motivator that's ever worked long term is gratitude. Now, if you're a believer in Jesus here tonight, you have several things. You have total forgiveness, total acceptance by God, a guarantee of heaven, and a personal relationship with God, not to mention the Holy Spirit living inside of you. We have all of these things that were given to us totally for free, right? So if you'll take a couple of minutes each day when you start your day and think about how much you've been given totally for free, you may be a little more motivated to talk to people. So just to make sure we're on the same page, I'm going to use the term believer a lot. And I don't mean someone who just believes that God exists. Almost everybody believes that. The term believer I use when I say that is somebody who's made that personal decision to trust Jesus. Now, here's a little summary of what I'm going to give you in this workshop. First of all, we're going to talk about some of the barriers, the common barriers to sharing our faith. Then I'll give you some real easy ways to bring up spiritual conversations in almost any conversation, spiritual things, without sounding awkward. I'll give you some ways to bring up and explain the gospel that won't sound awkward to you or the other person. We'll talk about some principles that have been real helpful for me. First, some of God's principles, and then some of mine. And finally, we'll talk about a lot of real-life situations that we all find ourselves in, and some things that I typically say. Now, you're going to notice as we go through that I use all the same stories and phrases and questions with just about everyone because they all sound very natural and normal to me. But if you hear one that you don't like or that sounds awkward to you, don't use it. Take it and change it to something that does sound natural to you. What I want to do is give you some principles and some tools. Now, how you apply those is really up to you. Now, let's be honest here. How many of you here are at least a little bit nervous about starting a spiritual conversation? That includes all of us, if we're honest. Me too. Believe it or not, every time I start a spiritual conversation, every single time, after 35 years of doing this, I get nervous. I feel some fear. Now, that's not likely to go away for me, and it isn't likely to go away for most of you. Personally, I think it's absolutely normal to feel a little nervous when we start a spiritual conversation. And I think it's unrealistic to expect that to go away. Now, I also want you to know that most of the things we're so afraid of that will happen when we bring up spiritual things almost never do. And if you'll take some of the things we're going to talk about and put them to use, you're going to find that most people do not respond negatively when we bring up spiritual things. Let's talk about some barriers to sharing our faith. Now, after talking to a lot of people over a lot of years about sharing our faith, I've come to this conclusion, that the biggest barrier to starting spiritual conversations is some kind of fear. And this fear takes a lot of different forms. Maybe we're afraid of what the other person will think of us. I think we all feel this to some degree. I know I do. You know, nobody wants to be known as just another pushy religious person, right? We may be afraid we'll do it badly, that we'll turn the other person off and turn them away from God. And that's the last thing we want to do. Maybe we're afraid that we won't be able to answer people's questions, that we just don't know enough to give them biblical answers. Finally, maybe you're afraid to bring up spiritual things because you just don't know how to do it without sounding awkward. So I'm here to assure you that almost every Christian feels some of these things, sometimes all of them. Because I'm sure of that because one of the things Jesus said to his followers most often, and I'm sure you know this, is he said, fear not, right? He said, don't be afraid. And I'm sure he told them that because he knew that they were afraid. And they had a lot more to be afraid of than we do. But those feelings of fear didn't stop them from sharing their faith, did they? And they don't have to stop us either. Now notice that Jesus did not say, don't feel afraid. He said, don't be afraid. There's a big difference. Fear is simply a feeling. Now we can't control our feelings, but we don't have to be controlled by our feelings. One of my favorite books on sharing your faith is by a guy named Bill Fay. I don't know if some of you have read it. It's called Share Jesus Without Fear. Well, it's a great book, but it's a lousy title. He should have titled it Share Jesus in Spite of Your Fear. And I told him that one time. I met him and I said, dude, you need to change the title of your book. He didn't, by the way. After one of these workshops, a lady came up to me and she told me that she had always been afraid of starting spiritual conversations, even though she really wanted to do it. And she told me, you know, if the other person brings up spiritual things, I'll talk to them every time. But if they don't bring it up, I usually don't say anything either. So if that applies to you, if you're real hesitant to bring up spiritual things in an ordinary conversation, you're in real good company. I think most of us feel this way. And again, I'm going to give you several ways to bring up spiritual things without sounding awkward. Now, another common barrier to sharing our faith is believing this misconception, that being effective in sharing our faith requires special gifting. Now, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the concept of spiritual gifts, right? One of which is the gift of evangelism. Now, let me ask you a question. Suppose you're absolutely convinced that God has not gifted you in this area. And suppose you're right, He hasn't. Will that stop you from being an effective sharer of your faith? No, it won't. Because the most important thing in sharing our faith is not our gifting. Now, yeah, Ed.
The Bible says we have this ministry of reconciliation.
Right.
And you're talking about the gift of the evangelism.
Right.
Can you give a good example of the difference between the two? Because in my mind, if we're all given the ministry of reconciliation, isn't that the same thing?
Yeah. Ed's question is, certain people are gifted in evangelism, but everyone has the ministry of reconciliation. Now, when Jesus gave the Great Commission, it wasn't just to 11 or 12 people. It was to everybody. So we are all expected to share our faith when we can in whatever way is comfortable for us. Not everybody's gifted in evangelism, but everybody needs to be able to share their faith. And if we have some creative ways to turn these conversations around, it makes it a lot more comfortable. The most important thing in sharing our faith is not our gifting, it's our willingness. There's a big difference between wanting to do something and being willing to do it. Now, deep down inside, you may not even want to start having spiritual conversations with other people. And if you feel that way, it's okay. I mean, on occasion, I feel that way too. But if you're willing to, despite how you feel, you're going to make an eternal difference to a lot more people. Now, what I want to do in this workshop is help you to be able to start spiritual conversations. And then once your conversation is going in a spiritual direction, to share your faith in whatever way is comfortable for you. And that's going to look a little different for everybody. The next misconception is this: I don't have the right temperament or personality. It's very common for us to compare ourselves with other people and to wish we were more like them, especially if we see what they have as an asset and what we have as a limitation. For example, the person that is introverted often feels like that's a hindrance to sharing their faith. And it makes sense because people who are extroverted talk a lot more. I mean, it's a lot more comfortable for an extrovert to start a conversation with somebody, spiritual or not. Outgoing people tend to talk a lot more. But what is one thing quiet people do a lot more? They listen. Exactly right. Someone once said that listening is the best tool we have in sharing our faith, and I think that's absolutely true. So really make an effort to start seeing your own temperament, your own personality as a gift that God gave you, that He wants you to creatively use. Now, back to the issue of being gifted in this area. Always remember this. Gifting is given to us, but skill is learned. I heard about a conversation that Michelangelo had with one of his admirers, and the guy said what a great gift God had given him. And he said, yes, God has given me a wonderful gift. And he said, but you would be shocked how many countless hours I spend working on that gift. Now, do I have some gifting in this area? I don't know. Maybe I do. But there are two main reasons I've been able to share my faith quite often, neither of which has anything to do with evangelism. First, I look for opportunities. I actively look for opportunities to share spiritual things. And second, I've trained myself to think in certain ways, which I'm going to share with you. Changes in your thinking will revolutionize the way you look at sharing your faith. Now, here is the main point of this whole workshop. Planting spiritual seeds and sharing the gospel sound much more natural after you've turned the conversation in a spiritual direction. Now, there are two parts to having spiritual conversations. The first one is taking a normal, everyday conversation and turning it in a spiritual direction in a very natural way. And then after you do that, actually discussing spiritual things, and when you can, explaining the gospel. Now, if you don't get anything else from this workshop, I would like for you to get this next point. In my opinion, this is the key to starting a spiritual conversation. Spiritual things don't come across as awkward only if they're brought up in context. Here's an example. Let's say you're on a plane, and the plane takes off, and you get settled in your seat. You say hello to the person next to you. They say hello back. You start a conversation. You start chatting, where you going? Is this a business trip or vacation? And you ask them some questions about their family. And it turns out they have children at home. A very normal question would be, how old are your children? Right? Now, let's say you get to your destination, and you're walking through an airport, and a person you've never met walks up to you and looks at you, and the first thing they say is, how old are your kids? Now, you're going to run away from that person, right? Same question. Why does it sound so weird in the airport and so normal on the plane? Because on the plane, it's asked in context. Here's a suggestion. I suggest that you always begin your conversations by talking about something else first, not spiritual things. And then, after you've learned some things about the other person, use something the other person has told you to turn the conversation in a spiritual direction. Here's an example of doing that. Several years ago, I met a guy through a personal friend of mine, and we were at a restaurant having dinner, and I found out that he was a big NFL fan. And I simply used something he told me that was important to him, in this case football, to turn the conversation around. And here's how I did it. This was back when Tom Brady was the MVP of the Super Bowl for the first time. This is several years ago. So I asked him, I said, you saw the Super Bowl, right? And he said, oh yeah, I never miss it. And I said, did you happen to see that interview with Tom Brady after the Super Bowl on national TV? And he said, yeah. I said, I didn't see it all, but I saw one section where Tom Brady looked at the camera and said, I've got fame, I've got fortune, and I've got a Super Bowl ring. And then he said this. He said, I can't help but wonder if there isn't more to life than that. And I said, that sounds like a spiritual statement to me. What do you think? And we went on to have a really good spiritual conversation. I have found that if you use something they shared with you, something personal, and you use that to turn the conversation in a spiritual direction, people will not react negatively the vast majority of the time. How often do you have a conversation like this? Somebody comes along, hey, how you doing? Pretty good. How are you? Good, thanks. Pretty common, right? Well, instead of letting it go there, don't stop there. Ask some questions. Find out some personal things about the other person. The more you know about the other person, the more often you're going to find something natural that you can use to turn that conversation around. Here's another example. I went to a place to get my oil changed several years ago, and I walked in, small waiting room. There was a guy sitting in a chair across the room, so I sat down. My first question, I said hi. He said hi back. So I knew he was open to talking. And I used this question. I said, do you come here often? Nice, normal, in-context question, right? And so it sounded normal, depending on, considering where we were and what we were doing. And this led to a really good conversation, which I'll share with you later. Now, speaking of asking questions, here is something I found to be very helpful, and that's this. Try to get into the habit of asking open-ended questions. These are questions that can't be answered yes or no. You'll get so much more information from someone with an open-ended question. For example, instead of asking someone, do you have any hobbies? Ask them, what are your hobbies? Or how do you spend your free time? Instead of asking someone if they're a sports fan, ask them, well, what sports do you follow? And instead of asking someone if they grew up going to church, ask them this question. What's your church background? This is my very favorite question, and I ask this almost every time I have a conversation. Now, it's often not the first conversation I have with them. It may be later, after I've developed a relationship with them. And I don't ask this question first. I only ask this question after spiritual things have been brought up in the conversation. If this is one of your first questions, it's going to sound a little out of place. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, that sounds good, but how would I do that in a normal, everyday conversation? Well, my suggestion is once you find out some things about that person, you can do this. You can mention a person you go to church with, or somebody you used to go to church with that has some things in common with that other person. For example, once I find out what somebody does for a living, chances are pretty good that I know a person I go to church with or used to who works in the same field that they do. And then I can mention my friend, and at some point I'll mention that I know him from church, and I'll go on and talk about some more general things. And since the word church has already come up in the conversation, it would be very natural to ask them about their church background. And you could say something like this. I mentioned my friend at church, and I hope you don't mind me asking, but I'm curious, what's your church background? Now, that sounds pretty normal and natural if you've connected it to something they told you about themselves. Here's an example of using this phrase. You might be talking to an OSU football fan. There are a couple of those around, right?
Amen.
So I will, let's say I'm talking to somebody who's an OSU fan. I'll say, I have a friend named Charlie Hayes, no relation to Woody, but he worked for the Dispatch for over 40 years, taking pictures on the sidelines at the games. And then I'll say, have you ever seen that picture of Woody Hayes in short sleeves in a snowstorm, completely oblivious to the fact that it's snowing? Have any of you ever seen that picture? It's world famous. Well, my friend Charlie took that picture, and he actually made me a big black and white print, and he signed it, and I have it hanging on my wall in my office. And then I'll say, Charlie's a great guy. I originally met him at this church I go to. And then I'll go on and talk about some other things. And then, I'll say, I mentioned my friend Charlie. I met him at church. I hope you don't mind my asking, but I'm curious. What's your church background? Now, that sounds very normal and natural, right? Suppose you're talking to a coworker or a neighbor, somebody you've had several previous conversations with, and you've never brought up spiritual things, but now you'd like to. Well, think back to something personal they shared with you about themselves. You could do this. You could say, I think I remember you telling me, and then add something that they told you. For example, suppose they told you they're a Cleveland Browns fan. I would probably say, I have a couple of friends at this church I go to who are really dedicated Browns fans. And then I'll say, they are depressed all the time. And that's always the response you get. And they nod their head and they laugh. And then a bit later, you could say this. I don't think church has ever come up before in one of our conversations. And I hope you don't mind me asking, but I'm curious. What's your church background? So I don't know about you guys, but this sounds very natural and normal to me. And it's not the least bit pushy. Now, once you find out their church background, here's another common question that I ask. I say, do you still go there? And if they do, you can ask them some questions. The answers to the questions that you ask can give you some really good ideas about the experiences they had. Ask how long they've been going there. Ask what the service is like. Ask what they teach there about salvation. If they say they don't still go to church there, the way they say it can tell you an awful lot. If they say, no, I know I should, but I don't, you could say, why not? And they may tell you. If they say they don't go there anymore and they're real emphatic about it, you could add, sounds like you didn't have very good experiences there. What was it that turned you off so much about that place? And they may tell you that too. Now you know what their church background is. You know if they still go there. You may know a little bit about their experiences there. So here's a quick summary of what I typically do. I ask some questions, find out some things about them, bring up a person I know that has a similar background or a similar interest, mention I go to church or used to go to church with that person, find out about their church background if they still go there, and then find out a little bit about their experiences. I can't stress enough how important it is to remember the things that people tell you. And the only foolproof way to do that is to write them down. Now, I do this with the only part of my brain that remembers everything, my smartphone. After a conversation, I always stop after the conversation is over, and I write down a couple of details about what they told me. That way I can think about what they said, and next time I see them, I can bring up something that I didn't think about. Here's a little tip that those of you with a smartphone can do this. Here's what I do. I set up my contact list with first name first instead of last name first, alphabetically. It's easier to remember Bob than his last name. So that's what I do, anyway. Once you find out details about somebody, it would sound very normal to do this. You could relate a story about yourself or someone else who has a similar church background. If their church background is the same as mine, I may tell them a little bit about my experiences. If theirs doesn't match mine, I may bring up a friend of mine or even a friend of a friend who has the same church background and tell a little bit about what their experiences were like. Now, I personally know somebody who grew up in almost all the major denominations, and you probably do too. But if you can't think of any, start talking to your friends who are Christians. Ask them what their church background was. Ask them what it was like to go there. Ask them whether or not they heard the gospel explained at that church. You're going to be shocked at how many people spent decades in a church and never once had the gospel explained to them, even after many years of attendance. Now, here's a good principle that I use. Don't assume that a person is a Christian just because they have a long church background. A lot of church members, and believe it or not, some ministers and priests are not believers in Jesus. And they need to hear the gospel every bit as much as anybody else. Now, in order to know if a person has made that personal decision, you have to ask them if they've done it, right? So that person may be using all the right words, but may not know Jesus personally at all. Here's an example. Many years ago, a guy called me on the phone, and he said, excuse me, I'm going to put my hoodie on. The older I get, the colder I get. So this guy calls me on the phone, and he said, Jeff, my name is Harry. I'm sort of your cousin. Well, being from West Virginia, that narrowed it down to about 2 million people, right? But he actually is my cousin. He's my grandmother's nephew. So we started hanging out together. He started to come to church with me. He started to come to our small group Bible studies. He even prayed with us on a regular basis. And after a while, I realized, I have never asked him if he's made that personal decision to trust Jesus. So when I asked him, he thought about it, and he said, I can't remember ever doing that. So I encouraged him to make that decision so he would know for sure, which he did. He knew a lot about the Bible. He had gone to church for years, but he had never had anybody explain the decision. So I can't tell you how many times after that he thanked me for making sure that he knew the Lord. Now, I would have done Harry a great disservice if I had assumed from what he was saying that he was a believer instead of asking him myself. So keep in mind that the first thing I did with Harry was I built a relationship with him. That's what I did first. Getting to know people is a big part of sharing our faith. Here's a good question for you. How much time do I spend relating to people who are far away from God? Now, for some of you, this may sound very appealing, and some of you, it may sound even scary. But if we're going to share our faith in Jesus with people, we're going to have to build relationships with them. Because most of the time, you're going to have to earn the right to share what you know. Now, the old saying is so true. People don't care how much we know until they know how much we care. Sometimes, if you just have a few minutes with someone, you can make that connection. It doesn't have to be years building a relationship. For some of us, caring about other people is real easy. But if you're not a people person and people in general bug you and you don't even like most of them, that's okay. The first step for you is not to just grit your teeth and go talk to somebody. The first step for you is to pray. Pray and ask God, sometime between you and God, doesn't have to be in front of anybody else. Pray for God to help you start seeing people the way He does, as lost, and people that Jesus died for, because that's exactly who they are. If you start treating people like they really matter, even if you don't feel it at first, you're going to start having more empathy and more compassion for people. No matter what kinds of sin areas they have in their lives, no matter what their lifestyle is, and I know that's hard, believe me, I know, you'll probably find your attitude toward people starting to change. And when people feel like they're important to you, believe me, they're going to be more receptive to what you have to say. Now, there's another answer that you may get to someone's church background. What if someone says, I don't have a church background at all? I never went to church growing up. I always say this, boy, are you lucky. You got a real advantage over the rest of us. And they'll say, what do you mean? And I'll say, just think of all the wrong things you don't have to unlearn. And they always smile and they laugh. What if they say, what do you mean wrong things? Then you can say something like that. Well, a lot of people grew up in a church where they were taught that you just have to follow the rules and try real hard to be good, to please God. And after hearing that for years, it's awfully hard to unlearn it and understand the total acceptance we can have for free by just trusting Jesus. Sounds very normal and natural and not at all pushy, right? Now, another question that I ask is this. How about your family? Do they still go there? If this person's family has been going to the same church or denomination for decades, believe me, family loyalty to a church or denomination can be very strong. And some of you know this from personal experience. Now, a lot of people are very hesitant to even consider something different than what their church teaches and what their entire family believes, even if what they're hearing from you is the truth. Let's say you're talking to somebody who's been going to the same church all their lives, and they don't hear the gospel presented there. Now, when you bring up a personal decision to trust Jesus, They may be actually afraid to even consider it because they may feel like they'd be betraying their family. So if it's obvious that they're feeling this way, you could say something like this: I'm not suggesting you leave your church. Far from it. And that's not the issue anyway, is it? The issue is, does this person know Jesus? If they don't think you're trying to pull them away from their church or their family or their culture, they may just relax a little bit and actually hear what you're saying. So if your conversation is going in this direction, you may add something like this. You know, making a personal decision to trust Jesus would not mean that you're no longer a Catholic or a Presbyterian or a Lutheran or Episcopalian or whatever they happen to be. It would simply mean that you would have a personal relationship with God instead of just being a member of a church. Now, you've planted a big seed by saying that, and they're going to remember it. Now, let's talk about bringing the gospel into the conversation. One of the main ways I use this is by using their church background. For example, let's say the person attends the same kind of a church that I went to for 3 years when I first moved to Columbus. I would say, you know, I went to the same kind of church you do for 3 years when I first moved to Columbus. And then I would say this, which is absolutely true, folks. I went to this church for 3.5 years, and this next statement is true. I would say, you know, one of the things I clearly remember is that I didn't hear anyone from the pulpit talking about personal salvation. You know, making a personal decision to trust Jesus. How did they present that in your church? Nice, open-ended question. Or you can relate the experience of a friend of yours who went to the same church that they did. And you can say this, you know, I have a friend who went to the same kind of church you did. And you know, one of the things he told me was that he never heard anybody from the pulpit talking about personal salvation. You know, making a personal decision to trust Jesus. How did they present that in your church? Or how did they present that in your parish? Folks, I have done this countless times, and I have never had anyone respond in a hostile way. Oh, I've had people who don't want to talk about spiritual things, and so will you. But if you do these things in a gracious way and not pushy, people usually respond pretty well. Now, let's talk about explaining the gospel. You may be wondering how you can explain the gospel to someone without coming across as preachy or pushy. And this is the point where a lot of us get stuck, isn't it? Talking in general terms about God and spiritual things is pretty easy. But giving the gospel to someone is a little more daunting, right? Yeah. One good principle that I keep in mind is much of the time we should keep our explanations pretty simple. Most people don't need deep theological truths. They just need to hear about God's offer in a way that makes sense to them. Now, the basic gospel message is very simple, right? It only has two parts. The good news, well, the bad news, our guilt, and the good news, salvation through trusting Jesus. Now, if the person you're talking to already knows the bad news, if they already understand they're guilty and they need forgiveness, then all they need to hear is that they can have it by simply choosing to trust Jesus and what he did on the cross. Sometimes it doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. But a lot of times, even when this personal decision is out on the table, people really don't understand what that means, especially if they've come from a formal background where that wasn't taught or recommended. We need to explain the gospel in a way that people can really understand the offer. So I want to give you a couple of ways that I routinely do this. Here's something I'll do very often. I'll say, well, you've heard the word gospel, right? And I'll nod my head, and they'll nod their head back, even if they've never heard the word. And then I'll say, you know, it sounds like a religious word, but actually it just means good news. And the opposite of good news is, and then they'll finish the sentence for you. The bad news is we've all violated God's standards. And then I always say, I don't know about you, but I know I've done that many times. And they'll often agree. And then I'll say this. It's kind of like the justice system in this country. When someone breaks the law and they're sent to prison, we say they're paying their what? their debt to society or their dues. That violation of the law creates a real debt that somebody has to pay. In the same way, we owe God a big debt, and that's where Jesus comes in. His death on the cross can pay that entire debt that we owe to God, so he won't have to judge us when we die, and that's why it's called good news. That was very simple, quick explanation, and very biblical too, right? Here's another way that I use to explain the gospel. An adoption analogy. I'm sure everyone in here knows that when we get saved, we get adopted into God's family, right? We are now God's adopted sons and daughters. So you could say something like this. Have you ever heard the saying, we're all God's children? And I'll say, oh yeah. And then I'll say, well, that isn't technically true. There's a big difference between being one of God's creations and being a member of his family. There's a huge barrier between us and God, our violations of his standards. In other words, we're separated from God because of our sins. But when we make the decision to trust Jesus, we get adopted into his family. And once this happens, God doesn't see us as guilty and alienated anymore. He sees us as his own son or daughter. Now, both of these ways are very biblical, right? And I can tell you that when you use little analogies like this that people can really relate to, they start understanding God's offer a lot more clearly. Now, if you go back and read the Gospels, you'll see how often Jesus did just this, right? What do we call the little illustrations that Jesus used? Parables, exactly. And what is a parable? It's a little word picture, right? Word pictures are one of my favorite ways of explaining the gospel. Once the conversation is going in a spiritual direction, something will often come up that perfectly fits a word picture. And so here's what I normally say. I'll say, you're familiar with parables, right? And I'll nod my head, the little stories that Jesus used when he taught, and they'll nod their head back, whether they've ever heard of it or not. And I'll say this, well, maybe. Yeah. Oops, something is happening here. I don't know what it is. Can you stop that, Juan? Oh. Okay. I'm really messing up here. I pushed the wrong button. Anyway, if they say, you could say, suppose you think the law is ridiculous, shouldn't be on the books, and what you did wasn't a big deal at all. The next slide says this, well, your opinion wouldn't mean a whole lot to the court, would it? And they'll agree. Next slide says this, so to be really fair, after considering all the evidence, what would the judge have to do? And they will probably say he'd have to pronounce you guilty, right? And then you can say this. The next slide says, now suppose the judge offers to serve the sentence for you. Justice would still be served, right? Somebody would pay for that crime, but it wouldn't be you. And the next slide is, Jesus offers to pay the debt that we owe to God so that God doesn't have to judge you when you die. Let's say that you just said to the other person, you've heard the gospel, right? And they nod, like we talked about before, and you say, I don't know about you, but I know I've done that many times. And instead of agreeing with you, let's suppose they say this. That's the next slide. Suppose instead of agreeing with you, they say something like this. Well, sure, I've done some things wrong. Everybody has. What's the big deal? Well, to avoid an argument, you might say something like this, which is the next slide. I think most people would agree with you. Most of us tend to see the little things we do wrong as not a big deal. And then you could say, the next slide, you could say, well, tell me something. Have you ever told a lie? And unless they're really a liar, they're going to say, yes, I have. And then you can say, yeah, me too. Then you could say this. Suppose you tell a lie to your dog. Big deal, right? The next slide says, what if you tell a lie to your wife or your husband? A little bigger deal, right? Next, what if you tell a lie to your commanding officer in a combat zone and some soldiers get killed? Bigger deal. What if you lie to a federal grand jury? Well, unless you're Bill Clinton, you go to federal prison, right? So then you could say this. So the consequences get more severe depending on the importance of the person you're offending, doesn't it? And they'll agree. And when God himself is the one we offend, the consequences are quite severe. And you'll notice there was no argument at all in that conversation. Now, we need to always keep in mind that for someone to see the gospel as good news, they have to understand and embrace the bad news. They have to admit they're guilty and that they need God's forgiveness. And I think this is by far the biggest barrier for most people, not being willing to admit that they're guilty enough to deserve God's judgment. And this attitude is going to keep a lot of people out of God's kingdom. Paul points out in 1 Corinthians 1:28 that the gospel message is utter foolishness to someone who doesn't think they need it. And if you guys can think back to before you were saved, you might have felt this way too. Now, we all know someone that we think is never going to respond to this. But we all know that only God's Spirit can convince someone of the bad news. We can help that process by pointing out the truth, but we should always do it in a gracious way. Now, there are a lot of people out there who do understand that they're guilty. Some of them think that they're too guilty for God to forgive. If you haven't met someone like this, you probably will. Here's a good way to respond to that. The next slide. Someone who thinks that they're too guilty for God to ever forgive them. You could ask them a question. Have you ever, and you can fill in the blank. You could use some biblical examples of people who were very bad people who were forgiven. You could use Paul as an example. You could say to that person, tell me something. Have you ever arranged for someone to be killed just because they believed in Jesus? Chances are fairly good they'll say no. Then you can say the guy who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament did just that. If you're talking to a man, you can say, and he's married, You can say, have you ever given your wife to another man to sleep with to save your skin? Abraham did just that. You could use King David as an example. You know, depending on how worldly the person is, you could say, have you ever gotten your neighbor's wife pregnant and then had him killed to cover it up? You ever done that? King David did just that, folks. So the Bible is full of very bad people who were forgiven. And deep down inside, most of us have done some things wrong too, haven't we? No matter how bad that person is, you can find an example in the Bible of somebody that was forgiven. Now, suppose we're talking to somebody, and the next slide, someone who does admit their guilt, but they tell you, but I believe in God. Well, that's great. I'm glad you do. Then you can say, you're familiar with parables, right? The little word pictures, etc. And then you could use this one on the next slide. The word picture of a cure for terminal cancer. You can say to the person, let's say you just got diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, the worst one there is. And let's say that you join an experimental study group and they give you a pill that they guarantee you will cure your cancer. Now, you can take that pill home and set it on your table, and you can look at it every day, and you can believe with every fiber of your being that it will cure you. But what would you have to do for that to cure you? You'd have to take it, right? So you can say to them, the next slide, for that pill to do you any good, no matter how much you believed it would help you, you'd have to take it. The next slide says, simply believing some facts about that pill wouldn't help much without an action on your part, would it? And the next one says, so I totally agree with you that believing in God is a great thing, and it is something that pleases Him. But getting our sins forgiven involves coming to God His way and making a personal decision to trust Jesus. Now, these things don't end up in an argument the vast majority of the time, because one of the things you're doing is you're agreeing with part of what they say. One of the principles that I always try to follow is the next slide. Try your best to have a discussion, not an argument. And the best way to do this is to simply agree with the person. The next slide says this, because you can't have an argument with someone who just agreed with you, right? For example, let's say you brought up the bad news, our guilt, and they respond with something like this. The next slide says, well, after all, nobody's perfect. A good response would be, yep, you're right. Nobody's perfect. What if they say this? Well, all we can do is try to do our best. You can say, yep, you're right. That's all we can do. Let's try our best. What if they say, well, I always try to do the right thing? You can say, that's great. I think most people do. Right? No defensiveness, no argument. We should agree with them. And then you can add this. Next slide. I think what you're saying is that you've lived a pretty good life, right? And they'll usually say, yeah. And then you can say something like this. Well, using human standards, I'm sure you have lived a pretty good life. Using human standards, most of us have lived pretty good lives. But unfortunately, God's standard is perfection. So no matter how good we look next to other people, we fall impossibly short of His standards. Now, suppose they point out to you how unrealistic that is for God to expect us to be perfect. You can say, yep, you're right. It is totally unrealistic. God knows we could never do it. That's why Jesus died on the cross, so God could treat us as if we were perfect. And again, no argument. You're not correcting them. You're not jumping in and getting defensive. Now, they may not make a decision to trust Jesus at that point and admit their guilt, but they will hear you. And they might move one small step closer to making that decision. I want to share something with you that I routinely don't do. This is just my personal preference. I don't use the term Christ when I'm talking to non-Christians. Most of them don't know what that means anyway. I use Jesus' name. I think it sounds more personal. That's just what I do. Here is a real good way to share spiritual truths with people. The next slide says third-party stories. In other words, this is a story that you're telling someone about someone else. You're not talking to them, you're talking about someone else. The other person clearly hears what you're saying, but you're not talking directly to them. This is a very non-threatening way to share things with people, and it doesn't come across as confrontive or corrective at all. A good example of this is telling someone a story about a friend of yours who has the same church background, or the same interests, or the same occupation that they do, like we talked about before. A real good example is Pastor Bob's story. Some of you have probably heard his story about when he was shot. No one can argue with Bob's experience because it's his. And they clearly hear about the supernatural way God saved Bob's life. Now, you can create a whole collection of these third-party stories like I have, and you can use one depending on the situation that you're in, if it's appropriate. You can use one of my stories. Here's a real good way to do that. The next slide says this: the next time someone asks you what you've been up to lately, you could say this: well, I did do something interesting lately, and they'll say, well, what? And then you could say, next slide, well, I took a class at this church I go to about having spiritual conversations with people without being weird and pushy. And then you could say, boy, I've run into some people who desperately need to take that class, haven't you? And they'll do just what you did. They'll laugh and they'll agree. And then you can say this: anyway, the guy teaching this class told a story about, and then use one of my stories. They're not copyrighted. Feel free to use them anytime you want. Here's a creative use of a third-party story. I think most of us would agree that we're perfectly comfortable talking about spiritual things with our Christian friends, right? So here's a good way to plant a seed with someone. The next slide says this: overhearing a conversation at a restaurant. Now, have you ever been in a restaurant where the tables or booths are so close you can hear everything the other people are saying? Well, guess what? They can hear everything you're saying too. So what you could do is you could do this. You could bring up a person that you know who never had the simple gospel explained to them. And you could say to the person you're with something like this: you know, I was surprised that she never had anyone explain that she could get total forgiveness by God by simply making a personal decision to trust Jesus. Now, the people at the next table will hear you, and you'll plant a seed. Now, if you do this, here are a couple of suggestions. First of all, bring up the other person in the context of a normal conversation, not just out of nowhere. And next, and this is real important, make sure that the other people hear what the rest of what you're saying sounds like it comes from two very normal people. Now, you know what I mean by that, right? Not a lot of Christianese talk, not a lot of things that we normally do with our Christian friends, just normal conversation. If you bring that up in context, it's going to sound pretty normal. And they will hear you. Speaking of being in a restaurant, I have a friend whose son is a server. And I don't bring this up to step on anybody's toes because I've done this before. But anyway, this guy's son told him that the very worst time to be a server, the time that he dislikes the most, is on Sundays when church is let out. Because he said often church people are the most demanding, rude, worst tippers that he ever runs into. Folks, that's true. I'm not saying it's true of us, but it's often true. Just keep that in mind when you're dealing with a server after church, because they may be watching. They may be seeing. If they hear you talking about the Lord, make sure you're gracious and patient and a good tipper. Makes a big impact. Now, let's talk about some of God's principles. Bob, would you do me a favor and hand these out? These are the verses from Colossians 4, 3 through 6. I would like for somebody, well, I'll tell you what, since the slides are not working, I'll go ahead and read the slides. They're on your handouts. Colossians 4, 3 through 6. This is, to me, this is the best. Just take one to take home with you. I think this passage is the best summary in the Bible for how we should approach people with the message of the gospel. Now, who wrote the book of Colossians? Paul did. Who inspired Paul to write the book of Colossians? That's right, the Holy Spirit. So here's God telling us how he wants us to deal with people when we're out sharing the gospel. Starting today, I think these passages are going to mean a lot more to you than they ever did before. So what I want you to do is take this little card. It's my gift to you. Take it home with you. Tape it on your bathroom mirror. And every morning when you're standing there looking at that incredibly attractive person standing in front of you, take a couple of minutes and read these verses and think about them. If you do this in the morning, your day will change. I promise. I see 6 crucial principles in this passage. Let's go through them one by one. The first one is pray for open doors. We need to pray for God to open doors for the message, to work behind the scenes, to put us in situations that are conducive to spiritual conversations. And the more we ask for him to open these doors, the more doors he's going to open. And the more often we ask, the more often we're going to be looking for these open doors, because they are there. We also need to arrange for God to bring people into our lives who are open to spiritual things. Now, in order to know if a person is open to spiritual things, we have to have a conversation. So we need to ask God to give us the willingness and the desire to bring up spiritual things. Do you pray for God to bring open people in your life? Do you pray for him to give you the willingness and the desire to open your mouth? If you do, you'll be surprised how often he answers these prayers. Second, proclaim the gospel clearly. Remember that Peter and Paul didn't just go into a town and hand out leaflets, although there's nothing wrong with handing out leaflets. What they did was they had a conversation. They had a dialogue, right? They didn't just go into town and build a church building and wait for curious people to show up. There's nothing wrong with a church building. But this is what they did. They had a dialogue with people. When we're talking to people, there are a lot of things we can do to adorn the message. Things like loving people, serving them, being gracious and kind, meeting their physical needs. Those things are important. But the next slide on your handout says this: there is no substitute for explaining the gospel verbally. Can you do this? Can you explain the gospel very simply? A short presentation. It doesn't need to be long. Doesn't need to be complicated. Remember that the gospel message is very simple. The bad news, our guilt before God. The good news, trusting Jesus to pay. Now, getting to the point in the conversation where we can do this without sounding awkward is the hard part, right? Well, unless you're Pastor Bob. Everybody expects him to talk about spiritual things. But for the rest of us, it's a little harder. The next thing that I see in this passage is use wisdom when dealing with non-Christians. This is so important, folks. If we treat people like projects, if we're arrogant or pushy or self-righteous, we're not going to be very effective in sharing our faith in Jesus, even if our message is technically correct. If you've ever had one of those pushy religious people come up and corner you, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The next one is take advantage of the opportunities that God does give you. When you're in a situation where you can very easily bring up spiritual things, then despite the nervousness you're probably going to feel, choose to speak up and talk to them, because that person may very well be somebody who's open to the gospel. But you won't know that until you talk to them. Fifth, be gracious to the people you interact with. Treat them like they're someone that God loves, that someone Jesus died for, because that's who they are. Let's not be so quick to correct people. Let's not be so anxious to point out the flaws in someone's beliefs and worldview. You know, we want so badly for people to hear the truth that it's real easy to get into the habit of jumping in too quickly and correcting people. The last principle in this passage is be prepared and willing to answer people's questions. Now, this is one of the main reasons we spend so much time studying the Bible, right? So we know what's in there. I heard a real good analogy about people who know the Bible well, and that compared them to people in the Treasury Department who deal with counterfeit money. These people spend an awful lot of time studying real money, and they know real money so well that the counterfeit screams at it when they see it. And that's what we need to be able to do with the Bible. 1 Peter, the next slide on your handout, puts it this way: always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that's in you, but with gentleness and reverence. Now, notice that Peter says make a defense. He does not say get defensive. There is a big difference. Now, we do need to be able to give people reasons for why we believe what we believe. We need to give them reasons for why we believe that the Bible is actually true, as opposed to the writings of the Eastern religion or the Book of Mormon or the Quran. Can you give people some solid reasons, evidence, why you believe that the Bible is really true? If you can't, then get a book or two on evidence that the Bible is true. There are lots of really good ones out there. One last point about this passage from Colossians 4 is that you'll notice in the first verse, Paul says, pray for us that God would open a door for our message. Notice he's including himself here. And he wrote this from a jail cell, didn't he? Because Paul knew that no matter where he was, God could open a door for the gospel. Now, that's obviously true. Look at what happened in the jail cell in Philippi, right? The jailer and his whole family got saved that night. And this happened in large part because Paul was actively looking for a way to plant seeds. He was actively looking for a way to turn his very bleak situation into an opportunity to share the gospel. There will be the opportunities for us, no matter where we are, no matter who we're with, to turn a conversation around if we just look for it. Now, one of the barriers we talked about is being afraid you don't have enough information to answer people's questions. Maybe this is your concern. Maybe you think you have to be a Bible scholar to be effective in sharing your faith. Well, obviously that's not true. How many of Jesus' early followers were New Testament scholars? How many? 0, right? They didn't have the New Testament. They didn't have Romans 3:23 and Romans 8:28 or Revelation 3:20. They didn't have any of that. But they knew Jesus, didn't they? A lady came up to me a couple weeks after one of these workshops and she said, you know, this had been the biggest barrier in sharing her faith. She felt like since she didn't know the locations of the important verses, she couldn't be effective. And then she looked at me and she said, you know, I may not know chapter and verse, but I do know the truth. And she said that gave her the motivation and the freedom to go out and share her faith a lot more often. Maybe it'll do the same for you. There is a list of easy verses that you can memorize on your handout that you can walk someone through the good news using the Bible if you'd like to do that. Now, when someone asks you a question and you don't know the answer, just be honest. Say, I don't know. And then tell them, but I'll find out for you. And then go do your homework. Do some research. And then go back and tell your friend, well, you found out. The issue that you actually cared enough about them to go find an answer will probably make a bigger impact than the answer to that question. Now, I want to look at a few general principles that have been real helpful for me. Always remember that success in sharing our faith is not having someone to pray in our presence to trust Jesus. That is a wonderful experience that some of you have had, but that is not the proof of our effectiveness. The next slide says, success in sharing our faith in Jesus is simply being willing to open our mouth and plant spiritual seeds with people. Never forget the results of that conversation are strictly between them and God, which means that anytime you even make the effort to plant a seed with somebody, regardless of their response, you have succeeded. There is no other area in life that you can point to where every time you attempt something, you cannot fail. This is the only area in life that's like that. What it means is that if you just try to talk to someone about spiritual things, then you're right in the middle of God's will. And that's pretty cool. Now, you're going to hear some stories from me, a couple tonight, but most of the time next week, about some people who were open to spiritual things and about some who did make the decision to trust Jesus. But many of these spiritual conversations I have with people go absolutely nowhere. What time is it? Oh, okay. Okay. Somebody wave at me at 8:25. Many of the conversations I have with people about spiritual things go absolutely nowhere. And you're going to have the same experience. Let's say you leave this workshop and you decide you're going to have spiritual conversations with a lot more people. And suppose the first 10 people you try to talk to are completely uninterested. Now you're going to think some things like this. You are going to think, well, I guess people aren't nearly as open as that guy said they were. Apparently they're not as interested as he said they are. You may think this, all I'm doing here is pushing this person farther away from God, and that's the last thing I want to do. You know how I know that you're going to have these thoughts? Not because I'm omniscient, because I've been there. I've had all of these thoughts before. When these thoughts come, and they will, don't believe them, because they are not true. You're going to run into a lot of close people, just like I have. But that shouldn't change what we do a bit. Because if you share a spiritual truth with somebody in a gracious, patient way, God will use that some way in their lives, even when you don't think that's ever going to be possible. Like the Jewish lady who was important in saving Bob's life. He never thought, did you, that she would ever respond. But she did. And it was in large part because the seeds he planted over a couple of decades. 24 years. So don't ever forget that seed you planted, God will use it. The next principle is this. Learn from your mistakes and keep trying because you will make them. Now, we would need another few hours for me to tell you about all the times I've blown it in this area. But I'm going to share with you one that happened right at the beginning of my efforts to share my faith, which was 35 years ago. I met a young man and found out that he was studying the Bible with some people who were involved in one of the false religious groups of that day. And I invited him to come to a Bible study at our church, which he did. He really enjoyed himself. I introduced him to some of my friends. He heard the gospel very clearly. Now, what should I have done with this guy at that point? I should have complimented him on seeking the truth, right? I should have invited him to come back. I should have continued to build a relationship with him. You know what I did instead? I tried to convince him that the people he was studying the Bible with, who were his friends, by the way, were cult members. He left. I never saw him again. Now, at that point, I could have said to myself, this just is not working. Obviously, I'm no good at this. I don't ever want to do that again and turn somebody off. I think what I'll do is I'll just leave this up to the people who seem to be good at it. And I'll find another way to serve God. Now, looking back, that would have been a huge mistake on my part, wouldn't it? And it would be a huge mistake on your part. So, you will blow it. And when you do, keep trying. When you make mistakes, learn from the mistakes, but don't give up. like I said before, one of the key components to this whole process is to change some of our thinking. Now, everybody in here has looked at somebody in their past and thought, this person will never respond to spiritual things, right? We've all done it. One of the critical changes we need to make in our thinking is the next principle. Resist the idea that no one is interested. If that were true, nobody would get saved, would they? Here's a good example of why we need to resist this kind of thinking. I have a friend at church who's an optometrist, by the way, and he used to be a real dedicated sharer of his faith, but over a period of time, he got distracted by other things, and he just slowly stopped sharing his faith with anybody. He even had himself to the point where he was convinced that nobody wanted to hear it, especially from him. And this thinking had completely neutralized him from ever sharing his faith. And he told me that he had felt so guilty for so long that he just couldn't stand it anymore. So he was in Milwaukee in a taxi. And he sat there and he thought, I have just got to say something to this guy. And he looked in the rearview mirror at the driver, and completely out of context, completely out of the blue, he blurted out, could I ask you a question? The guy said, yeah, I guess. If you died today, where would you spend forever? Now, this is a cab driver in Milwaukee, okay? He's thinking, oh, man, why does he want to know about what happens when I die? You know what he was thinking? He was thinking he was in trouble. But once he figured out my friend wasn't going to do him in, they went on to have a great spiritual conversation. After my friend got out of the cab, this guy gave him his cell number. And he said, if you're ever back in Milwaukee, call me, and we'll continue our conversation. My friend was totally blown away that this guy was even willing to talk about spiritual things. Now, it's still hard for him to start spiritual conversations, but he does it a lot more often. Folks, if we're convinced that that person is not interested in spiritual things, we're not going to try very often. So get into the habit of doing this next slide on your handout. Start assuming that people do want to talk about spiritual things, because a lot of them really do. Now, I know, okay, almost done. 5 more minutes and we're finished. I know you're not going to believe this just because I said it was true. But if you start bringing up spiritual things in a gracious way and in context, you're going to be surprised how many people are open to talking to you about spiritual things. Now, there's a very important corollary to this, and it's the next slide on your handout. We should also assume that people don't want to talk about spiritual things with someone who's pushy and uptight. So don't be one of those people. I'm guessing that some of you here don't share your faith very often because someone who was real pushy and weird tried to talk to you. And they may even have had the message technically correct, but the way they did it really turned you off, didn't it? But you did become a Christian, didn't you? In spite of your bad experiences, which means that there was at least one person who did share the gospel with you in a patient and gracious way. And you can become that, you can be that person for someone else too. The next principle is the last one for tonight. It says the message will come across so much better if people see the messenger as fairly normal. And that's absolutely true. So we're going to stop there. We'll pick that up again next week. Sorry for the technical snafu. Does anybody have a...
All what you read was an answer. That's scripture. To anyone that asks you, it is within you with meekness and
Reverence.
reverence.
Yeah. That's a great book. Now, if anybody has questions, I mean, I'll stick around as long as you want to talk. You want to come up and ask me a question. You want to ask a question now, feel free.
You could check your bowlers to make sure that
No dental talk tonight, just biblical. Does anybody have a comment? Anything you want to add? A question? Anything?
We have a past coworker who does not believe that she is central, doesn't have any say.
Doesn't think she's a sinner. Yeah, I think you mentioned her to me. She's pretty generic. Well, I'll tell you what, there are an awful lot of people out there, more all the time. Yeah, and the best, of course, the best response to somebody like that is, I'm curious, hope you don't mind me asking, but what do you believe? And they will probably tell you.
Buddha and meditation.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, well, and you know, something, it's probably in here somewhere next week, but, you know, if somebody says to me, I believe in Buddhism, I follow this or I follow that, and I'll usually ask them, what drew you to that? What positive difference does that make in your life? And then they will say something like, it makes me a better person. I'll say, well, if our goal is to be a better person, any religious system will do that. Which is true, right? Buddhism, Hinduism, anyism will make you a better person. And I'll say, but if you want to get your sins to get forgiven, you have to come to God through Jesus. That's just, you know, that's very, very natural and normal. No arguments. We're not correcting them. We're not jumping in and pointing out how wrong their worldview is. Basically, we're just agreeing with it. How interesting. Yeah, so, yeah, next time I'm going to have a number of things to be able to say in that situation. But for me, don't be defensive. Don't have an argument. Agree with something you can agree with. Because you can't have an argument with somebody who just agreed with you. That's universal. They may like to argue, but you don't have to get in the ring with them, right? Yeah.
Well, the pastor will remind us that there's hours up here as we leave, and we can stand together and I'll say a quick prayer. Okay? I'm looking around tonight and the 2 or 3 people that I've identified that could use just. But I just. I've learned.